This video is a continuation of a discussion about modifying input parameters in vRO. We began the discussion back in part 50. If you haven't seen that part, take a look up here, go to part 50, and start back there. As I mentioned earlier, there's actually multiple techniques that you can use. Here comes the second technique, and as you can see, this is my preferred technique. And after I show you how it works, I'll show you why it's my preferred technique. Now that we know the first technique, let's take a look at the second technique. Again, I'm going to create a new workflow. So I'll say new workflow. I'll call this one second technique. And as in the previous example, I'm going to shortcut some things here. I'm not going to bother to type a description for the workflow, but I should. And I'm not going to type descriptions for my variables, though I should. But again, I'm going to try to do this more quickly. So once again, I'm going to create an input parameter called in_myvar. Once again, that one's going to be a number. And I'm going to create an attribute. Let me collapse this here. I'm going to create an attribute called myvar. And it too will be a number. So far, so good. So I have an attribute called myvar and an input parameter called in_myvar. Now to use the second technique, I'm going to go to the schema tab, and once again I'm going to drag out a scriptable task, and I may as well tell you what I'm going to be doing here. I'm going to make this scriptable task copy the input parameter to the attribute. Now to do so, I could use the in-out tab technique for creating the bindings that I need, or if you're familiar with this setup wizard, I could use that. In this case, though, I'm going to use a third way of doing binding, which is visual binding. So I'll go straight to the visual binding tab, and as we can see down below, let me resize things a bit here. The visual binding tab has several different sections. This section over here on the left side and this section over on the right side are telling me about my workflow variables. So in my workflow, I have an input parameter called in_myvar. I do not have any output parameters. I do have an attribute called myvar, and since it's an attribute, I can do an inward binding to the myvar attribute. But since it's an attribute, not only can I do an inward binding, over here we can see that if I wanted to, I could also do an outward binding to the attribute called myvar. So again, when you see the outer columns, remember those are workflow variables. On the other hand, this section in the middle is talking about the variables inside of the schema element that we have selected. So up above, I have selected the schema element called copy input parameter to attribute, and sure enough, down on the bottom, it tells us this section here is talking about the variables within the local variables within copy input parameter to attribute. Now, in this particular case here, if I want to copy what's in the input parameter, I need to create an inward binding to that variable. And to do so with the visual binding tab is really straightforward. I'm just going to click on this triangle corresponding to the input parameter. I'm holding down the button. I'm going to drag to the middle section and let go. And as you can see, what I now have is an inward binding. All the binding lines that you see over here are inward bindings. Any bindings you see over here are outward bindings. But my inward binding is between my input parameter called in_myvar and my local variable inside of the scriptable task that happens to have the exact same name. So in one sense, that's kind of convenient. I'll know exactly what I'm working with when I'm working with this local variable called in_myvar. I'll be seeing what's in the input parameter called in_myvar. Now for this technique to work, I'm also going to need to change the value of the myvar attribute, but I'm not going to create an inward binding because inward bindings don't let me change the value of an attribute, but rather an outward binding lets me do that. So I'll click, drag, and drop over here. So now within my schema element, I have a variable. They're both local variables, but I have a variable called INMyVar. It has an inward binding to the input parameter called INMyVar. That means I can see what's in that input parameter just by reading this local variable. And similarly, I have a local variable called myvar that is outwardly bound to the attribute called myvar. If I change the value of the myvar local variable, then the myvar attribute's value will also change. So right off the bat, I like this technique because it makes it really clear what binding's going on. And then in terms of the coding, yes, it does require some coding, but it's really straightforward. The code is simply going to be myvar equals, because I want to change the value of that variable. That's the attribute. I want to change its variable, and I want to change it to whatever's currently in the input parameter called INMyVar. And if you don't like doing all that typing, you don't have to type anything at all. Just insert your cursor here and click myvar. Well, you do have to type the equal sign. myvar, I got by clicking myvar, equals in myvar, semicolon, and boom, I'm done. That's all it takes. From here on out, if I want to, I can add additional schema elements and create an inward binding to the myvar attribute to see what's in there. Initially, I'll see the same value that the input parameter is set to, but because myvar is an attribute, I could also do outward bindings, thereby enabling me to make changes to the variable. So again, for me, this is the preferred technique to use out of these two techniques I've shown you because it's more explicit and more obvious what it's doing. I can see in a glance that I can see the flow of data. It looks like I've got data coming in from this input parameter, comes into my scriptable task, and it looks like it's going to go out to this attribute. And additionally, the code is very straightforward. Attribute name equals input parameter with a semicolon on the end of it. It's very straightforward code. The code's easy for me to write, but it's also easy for my coworkers who are going to be looking at my code, or even if I'm looking at my workflow 6 months from now, it's going to be more obvious to me what this workflow is doing. But regardless whether you use the first technique or this second technique, which is the one I prefer, they both work. So they're both valid ways of doing things. But in either case, what we have here in effect is a design pattern that you're going to see very, very often. The design pattern in effect is, as the first schema element in your workflow, add a scriptable task, and using either of these techniques, copy in one or more input parameters, not all of your input parameters, but copy in the input parameters that you expect to be changing in the workflow, and copy those input parameters to attributes. That is the design pattern that you'll see time and time again. And similarly, the same sort of issue exists for output parameters. Output parameters are write-only variables, which means you can change the value of an output parameter within your workflow, but you'll never be able to see what's in your output parameters. So as a design pattern, at the end of your workflow, you will put a scriptable task that copies any attributes whose values you want to save to output parameters. So again, this is just a run through of a couple different techniques. It's up to you to decide which technique you want to use. You know my preference, but you're the programmer, you're the one writing the workflow, you get to decide how you're going to write your workflow. I would be curious to hear from anyone who has any opinions on which technique you prefer. In particular, I would love to hear from people who prefer the first technique over the second technique. I've shown you how to do these two techniques. I've shown pretty clear what my preference is, but I would love to hear from you to find out what you think and what you find works best in your workflows. So take a few moments if you would, and let me know what you think down in the comments below. Thank you very much, and see you in the next video.
Hi everyone, Brian here. If you have additional topics that you'd like discussed regarding the vRealize Orchestrator, let me know in the comments down below.